Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Elliott School. My name is Alyssa Ayers, and I'm Dean of the Elliott School of International Affairs. We are going to be discussing today conflict in Ukraine. We have an incredible faculty expertise to bring insights to this question and alumni expertise as well. I think we can see before us some major questions that have risen to the top of the foreign policy agenda with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and we're going to discuss these today. We're likely to hear in this evening's State of the Union address the question of what this means for the challenge of authoritarianism in the world, the battle between authoritarianism and democracy. We're likely to hear continued questions about what this means for the ability of our global institutions to stave off conflict. We're likely to hear about the wake-up call that European countries have had on the question of security in Europe and how they can prepare to secure themselves. We're likely also to hear about the question of international law and international norms, the return of a 20th century kind of conflict in the 21st century. What does this mean for the international liberal order? We can also expect to discuss questions of the threat of nuclear weapons. We should also consider questions of the new world of disinformation, social media, cyber, and the digital space, and what that means, along with the question of economic implications that this crisis in Ukraine and Russia's invasion is creating. Sanctions have been imposed, creating new kinds of disruptions in global oil and gas markets, for example. Those are just a few of the questions that we're likely to hear about. We've got experts who can touch on all of these issues and more. Let me briefly introduce our panelists. I will be very brief so we can get to the heart of our conversation today. We are joined today by first Marlene Laruelle, who is the director of our Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies. She also directs our Illiberalism Studies program. Our Central Asia program, is co-director of our PONARS-Eurasia program, and is a research professor of international affairs. She works on the rise of populist and illiberal movements in post-Soviet Eurasia, Europe, and the United States. And her research explores how nationalist and conservative values are becoming mainstream in different cultural contexts. We are also joined today by our alum, Ambassador Kurt Volker, who received his master's degree in 1987 from the Elliott School. He is at present a senior international advisor with the BGR Group and a distinguished fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis. He is the former special representative for Ukraine negotiations, a former US ambassador to NATO. He has served in the State Department as the principal deputy assistant secretary of state for Europe, as well as on the National Security Council, handling European questions. So he is steeped in the recent diplomatic history of this region and these particular questions. We are joined as well by Alexander Downs, who is Associate Professor of Political Science and International Affairs and co-director of the Institute for Security and Conflict Studies. His work focuses on a variety of subjects in international security, including the question of foreign-imposed regime change, civilian victimization, military effectiveness, democracy, coercion, alliances, and solutions to civil war. All questions that are at stake here. His most recent book, very relevant in this context, is titled Catastrophic Success: Why Foreign Imposed Regime Change Goes Wrong, and it was just published in November. We are joined as well by Charlie Glaser, who is professor of political science and international affairs. He is the co-director of the Institute for Security and Conflict Studies. His work on international relations theory and international security policy focuses on the security dilemma, defensive realism, the offense-defense balance, and arms races. Should note here, his awards include the National Academy of Sciences William and Catherine Estes Award, awarded last year for behavioral research toward the prevention of nuclear war. He has also received the Michael E. Brown Research Prize here at the Elliott School, the Roth Family Distinguished Visiting Scholar at Dartmouth, 2019 to 2020, distinguished scholar at GW and the ISSS, the International Security Studies Section Distinguished Scholar Award for Lifetime Achievement in International Security Studies through research writing and mentorship. And we are joined by Mike Moore. He is Professor of Economics and International Affairs, Director of the MA in International Economic Policy program. His area of research includes US trade policy, economics of the WTO system, and the interaction between trade policy and climate goals. He served as senior economist for international trade on the President's Council of Economic Advisors from 2002 to 2003, and as a consultant to the World Bank, Department of State, and Department of Commerce. He is the former director of the Elliott School's Institute for International Economic Policy. So you can see from their bios that we've got faculty and alumni expertise able to cover every dimension of the crisis we are now seeing in Ukraine. Let me turn first to Marlene. Can you help set the stage for us and give us a kind of ground reality of what is taking place at this moment in Ukraine?
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for the invitation. So it has been 6 days now that the war is on, and the worst moments are still to come, unfortunately, with the likelihood of Kiev falling in the forthcoming days. But I think we already see some trends that will remain whatever the outcome of the battle on the ground will be. And I have 4 points that I would like to make to kind of launch our discussion. The first one is that we miscalculated the threshold of Russia, that the fact that Russia was not afraid to do what many both abroad and in Russia itself thought was imaginable. And so now we find ourselves with an incredibly volatile and dangerous situation, including a nuclear risk, which has come back on the table. So what we have seen is that Putin really taking on a new, qualitatively different level of risk that forced the West to recalibrate. And I think one of the big issues we face here is that we don't really know how to have a solution for the imbalance we face. The fact that for Russia, Ukraine is seen as a vital interest, and therefore Russia's threshold for inflicting pain and also receiving pain is pretty high, which is not necessarily our case. So it will be very difficult to reconcile the fact that the West doesn't want to go to war over Ukraine, and at the same time, we don't want to let the war against Ukraine go unpunished. So the balance is difficult to find, and I think the escalatory risks are really, really very high and very serious. Second point is that there will be no winner. Russia may win militarily, but it has lost on every other front. It has reinforced the European Union unity. It has reinforced the transatlantic relationship. It has legitimized NATO. It has lost Germany. It has lost a large part of its soft power. What we see when we look at what is happening on the ground is that the Russian army was badly and is still very badly prepared logistically, which raises question about its level of genuine preparedness. We also see that Russia miscalculated the resistance coming from Ukraine. And so what we can imagine is that Russia's military advantage over the Ukrainian army will slightly be modified as we move toward a much more kind of decentralized and mobile resistance. So Russia is likely to find itself stretched to hold conquer territories and at the same time to have probably to fight an insurgency. And that is kind of, it will be pretty difficult for Russia to manage that. What we may have at the end, it's a really destroyed Ukraine, and that will be, of course, a nightmare for Ukraine, but a big issue for Europe. Ukraine is not a small country. It will not be Kosovo. So that will be really on the long run, the level of conflictuality, the level of destruction in Ukraine will probably be huge, whatever will be the end. My third point is that we have a new Ukraine that emerged, and we also have a new Russia. And that will be kind of long-term trend. I think Ukraine has shown really its solidity, its unity, not only militarily in resisting longer against Russian troops that it was imagined, but also in terms of its maturity, of its political leadership. And I think Zelensky has been pretty exemplary in his role as head of state. and also the Ukrainian society has been really showing its commitment to defend the nation. So we can see that this Ukrainian nation building, in a sense, has been consolidated with the war, therefore creating exactly the contrary effect of what Russia was hoping. And I think this unification of the nation through the war experience, it will have an impact on any kind of post-war reconstruction. So all the previous discussion we had about Minsk II agreement, potential federalization of Ukraine, I think all that is totally over now because the nation has shown its kind of unity. A new Russia has also emerged, and I think it's important to discuss also what is happening in Russia and not to let it on the side. There have been many protests for what Russia can allow, many petitions coming from several professions, courageous statements by artists, by intelligentsia, by some oligarchs. And the reverse side of that coin, that's the repressive toolkit used by the regime has been increased to so far unknown levels. Closure of Facebook, Twitter, a list of new liberal websites to be closed, more than 2,000 people arrested on the Russian side, and now any anti-war statement will be treated as treason by the Russian judicial system. So it's really a much more repressive Russia that has emerged, and there will be no way back. We know that the Russian public opinion is quite divided, like 50% for, 50% against the war, but all that could change very rapidly because the sanctions are already felt in Russia at the everyday life. The ruble has lost 30% of its value. There are long queues to get cash everywhere in Russia, and there are discussions about the possible mobilization of men in Russia that would dramatically change the popular support in Russia for the war. I think linked to that, the issue of sanction, and we will be rediscussing that later. I understand the will to punish as part of the toolkit we have if we don't want to have soldiers on the ground. I think there is also a danger of building on our side a narrative about regime change in Russia. There is very low chances of a happy regime change in Russia. And I think that if the Russian, I mean, if Putin failed in its goal over Ukraine, it will be very difficult for him to survive in power. So we can see it has been really now interlinked with the regime. He may not be overthrown, of course, by public unrest. He may have to face some intra-elite tension, and I think they are there. We may not see them, but they are there. But so I think we should be very careful in kind of wishing the Russian regime to fail, because the chance of having something nicer arriving after is not there. And we should also be ready to imagine the danger that would represent a more dangerous Russia or an unstable Russia. My last 4 points is more a kind of conceptual issue as a scholar, but also in terms of our policy thinking, is that how do we avoid the narrative of the unavoidability of the war, the idea that the war was written in the DNA of the Russian regime. And I think that's a dangerous path, because it's kind of project retrospectively what Russia is today toward what Russia was in the past. And I think it's analytically false, because Russia had a series of options that could have been taken that would have been less confrontational. And so one of the big issues, I think, will be for us when we will have to imagine one day the post-war situation, and we will have to sit at the table of negotiation with Russia in one way or another, is to realize that there was a time there was more option on the table. And then the Russian state, or Putin himself, took that decision to move to something that is now where it will be very difficult to disentangle what is Russia's strategic demands about non-NATO expansion, which are kind of partly legitimate in the sense you can sit at a table, a diplomatic table, and negotiate over the European security architecture. Now that Russia makes the move not only of a really violent war, but also of creating a narrative justifying the war in the name of Ukraine not being a legitimate state and a legitimate nation, I think that is kind of, there is no more transaction possible on that aspect. And so in a sense, the Russian regime has killed any option of negotiating strategic issues by putting that in a kind of nation building or imperial memory aspect and denying Ukraine right as a nation and as a state. And so I think it's important to keep this kind of, to avoid this retrospective vision of Russia having always been ready for that war, to try to keep some option open, because at one day or another, we will have to sit at the table and try to get the best we can of this awful situation and try to rescue Ukraine from the war. I will stop here and let my fellow panelists continue the discussion.
Thank you. Ambassador Volker, Kurt, do you want to pick up from there and say a few words from your perspective, including the history of U.S. foreign policy?
Yeah, which goes back. But a couple of things, I'll key off a few things that Marlene said, and then go back a little bit. But first off, I think it's very important to distinguish between Putin and Russia. I don't think that the Russian people support this war on Ukraine. If there is data that says 50% do not, you know the number than that is actually higher, because there is no reliable data in Russia, because they don't allow any kind of freedom or media coverage, and people are afraid to answer truthfully. So that's one aspect. Second, I just think we need to be clear in the current day what's happening here. Putin has decided to launch a war of aggression unprovoked against Ukraine because he has a vision of rebuilding a Russian empire on the territory of the former Soviet Union. And he has said this. He said it in his National Security Council meeting a week ago, and that was the most direct expression of this. But his long essay from July of last year also laid out the so-called intellectual foundations of this sense. And it goes all the way back, and this is now, Alyssa, where I'll pick up kind of the walk through the history here. It goes back to his early statement when he was president of Russia in his first term, that the collapse of the Soviet Union was one of the great tragedies of the 20th century. And when he was elected 22 years ago, he was inaugurated as president of Russia. He said that his aim is to restore Russian greatness. And most of us at that time thought that he meant ending a period of Wild West capitalism and lawlessness that had taken hold in Russia in the first 10 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, Russian independence, and Russia's early days as a democracy. And we thought that was reasonable because it had gotten out of hand and Putin was going to restore a bit of order. But he clearly had something else in mind, because he quickly went about rebuilding the military, rebuilding the intelligence services, refurbishing the nuclear arsenal, and he embarked on a campaign to vest in the Kremlin control of most of the key levers of power in the country, including state-owned enterprises, the media, single political party, United Russia, with other parties tolerated only if they were bit parties to create the illusion of opposition within an effectively one-party system. The intelligence services, the military, and doing this through an effective network of former KGB colleagues of his. So there was a bit of trust among those in the system that they were all part of the same thing. That system has lasted and gotten stronger over time, and Putin has been at the center of it. And I think that they all kind of accept that the system works because they all agree that he's at the center, not that they all agree with one another. As you go through the time periods here, in 2007 at the Munich Security Conference, and I happened to be there with Secretary of Defense Gates, Putin basically declared his break with the European security architecture that had been in place since the Helsinki Accords. He said that Russia had been mistreated, that they do not accept a US and Western driven world order, and that they would begin taking things into their own hands, if you will. Within a year, well, within a few months of that speech, Russia suspended its participation in the CFE treaty. It suspended its implementation of many aspects of the Vienna document on transparency and observation of military exercises. Within a year of that speech, a year and a half, I should say, he invaded Georgia took 20% of Georgian territory. It engaged in all kinds of other activities and attacks, including the attacks on Russian former GRU intelligence officers in the UK, or KGB officers in the UK. Remember Litvinenko, remember Skripal, targeted assassinations. He really embarked on a series of rogue behavior. In 2014, he attacked Ukraine. What had happened in Ukraine, it's very important to remember the context here. There had been a so-called Orange Revolution in 2005. The Ukrainians were demanding that they have a more open democracy. After an election that appeared to be rigged, they ran a second election. Viktor Yushchenko won that election, but failed to govern effectively. And Ukraine did not escape from the mire of cronyism and corruption that has plagued it really ever since independence. And the next election, his rival, Viktor Yanukovych, came to power. Yanukovych was a Putin protege. He failed to invest in the military of the country. He did not embrace EU or NATO aspirations or European aspirations for Ukraine as the Ukrainian people wanted him to do. He was on the verge of signing an EU association agreement, and at Putin's request, demurred, did not sign it. This brought protesters out into the streets in Ukraine, demanding that he actually go forward and proceed with association agreement with the EU. And this was the Maidan. This protest lasted for some time, and Yanukovych authorized the use of force against the protesters, killing over 100 people. This then caused outrage in Ukraine that the president would be ordering force against his own people. The Rada met, they stripped him of his powers as president, and he fled the country. A few months after this, Russia then put in additional military forces into Crimea. It had legitimately had military bases in Crimea. They had a leasing agreement from Ukraine to keep their navy there until 2047. So there was no threat to Russia's presence in Crimea, but that wasn't the issue. The issue was that Putin wanted to reverse the government in Ukraine that had been put in place after Yanukovych fled. This was President Poroshenko on an interim basis and winning an election in his own right. So he put more forces, unmarked uniforms, intelligence officers, so-called little green men, special forces, into Crimea, and they disarmed the Ukrainian military that was there, expelled them, took over Crimea, organized a hasty and sham referendum where Crimea declared that it wanted to be part of Russia, and then Russia quickly annexed Crimea. It happened within the space of less than 2 months, and everyone in the West was shocked. Everyone in Ukraine was shocked. There were no bullets fired. There was no fighting over this. It was a swift move by Putin to take a piece of territory by force, and he got away with it. So as a result of that, he decided to open another front, which was to launch a war in eastern Ukraine, where, again, the same methodology, little green men, special forces, intelligence forces, and mobilizing local thugs, paying them, organizing them to create the appearance of an uprising in eastern Ukraine, which Putin used to then launch military attacks deeper into Ukraine from there. They got into a pretty good distance away from where they currently, well, I shouldn't say currently anymore, a pretty good distance away from the territories they occupied for the past 8 years, which is parts of Luhansk and Donetsk. They got further into Ukrainian territory. This time, the Ukrainians were aware of what was happening and fought back. And the Europeans were also a bit more aware of what was happening and immediately called for Russia to stop and a ceasefire and push back. There were a couple fits and starts in establishing a ceasefire line. Famously, there was the town of Debaltseve, which had not fallen, even though Russia had taken territory all around it. And the Russians agreed to the ceasefire, but then attacked Debaltseve anyway, took that city, and that established a more contiguous ceasefire line, which has been the line of contact that has been in play for the last 8 years. During this time, Ukraine, as Marlene said, strengthened its sense of national identity enormously. Before Russia attacked, you would find Ukrainians somewhat ambivalent. Are they Are they friends of Russia? Were they friends of Europe? Do they want to be in the EU? Do they want to be in NATO? Do they want to be neutral? There's a lot of nuance and shades in Ukrainian thinking. But after Russia's attacks, all of that went away. And people saw themselves increasingly as a Ukrainian people distinct from Russia. Whether or not they speak Russian is immaterial. They see themselves as Ukrainians. They committed themselves to wanting to be part of Europe and the West, including the EU and NATO. And they started building a stronger country. They made progress on anti-corruption reforms. They made progress on economic development. Not nearly as much as needed, but they were making progress along the way. Russia became concerned that Ukraine was succeeding, despite having taken pieces of its territory. And it's kept upping the ante, demanding things that Ukraine never be allowed to join NATO, that Ukraine stay out of the EU. They engaged in targeted assassinations, bribery, payoffs, everything. In the last year or so, I think several things have happened. Everything from Putin witnessing the botched withdrawal from Afghanistan of the US and NATO, where I think he concluded we did not have the will to use force, which I think gave him a sense of a freer hand in dealing with Ukraine. He also saw that there was fits and starts in leadership in Ukraine, and Zelensky's popularity, which had been in the 70 percentiles when he was elected, was down in the 20s. And so we thought that maybe this gives him a freer hand in Ukraine as well. I think also COVID led to the isolation of Russia and Putin. And I think that Vladimir Putin we are seeing today is not acting rationally. And the one thing I would maybe differ with Marlene on a little bit is regime change in Russia. I think that Russians see that Putin is not acting rationally. I think the Russian military sees this. I think the intelligence services see this. And so I think that they may be concerned about what he may do. They're going to give him a little leash to continue the war on Ukraine to see if he can actually suppress the Ukrainian resistance. It's not going very well. Russia has lost a lot of troops, a lot of equipment. They're putting in fresh waves. If they succeed in the next few days, then I think things will stay as they are. But if this goes on for another week, I think you're going to see people of significance in Russia moving to limit Putin's power, remove him from power. And what this would mean, as Marlene says, no guarantee that it is a friendlier face, but it may be a more rational face, which is what we're seeing now is irrationality, which I think is extremely dangerous. As far as US foreign policy goes, we have been consistent in supporting Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity as a principle, but we have been cautious in how much support we give to Ukraine. We've not supported in any practical way Ukraine's movement into NATO. There's been no membership action plan. We have put a lot of pressure on Ukraine to implement greater reforms and fight corruption, which has not always worked. And so we've been somewhat dissatisfied. And so many of the complaints that Putin has raised against Russia, against the West, against the United States, against Ukraine seeking to join NATO and so forth, are fabricated by Putin as a way to try to rally opinion and to justify his ambitions under the guise of defense rather than his own offensive aims at creating a new Russian empire. But as Marlene said, with this latest adventure into an open war against a sovereign state in Europe, Putin has really lost all pretense. The mask is off and he is clearly the aggressor. Ukraine is clearly the victim, and it has changed fundamentally world and particularly European attitudes toward Russia and Putin and towards Ukraine. I'll pause there.
Thank you, Kurt. Maybe that's the right place to pick up with Alex, your recent work on regime change. Why don't you tell us how you see the situation and its impact?
Sure. Thank you very much, Dean Ayers, for the opportunity to be here, and thank you all for being here today. I want to do a couple things. One is to just say a few words about the military situation as it's developing, and then talk about the potential aftermath here, assuming that Russia is able to change the regime in Ukraine and what might happen after. Just so on the military situation, as you know, the Russians launched a 3 or 4-pronged offensive into Ukraine last week. There's one prong coming from the north, from various places in Belarus and Russia aimed at Kiev and at Kharkov. There's a group coming from the south out of Crimea, heading north, and there's of course the eastern front with the breakaway provinces where there's activity as well. So what's the goal here? Quick seizure of the capital, overthrow the Zelensky regime, and put a pro-Russian figure in power, and then cut off and encircle the bulk of the Ukrainian army, which is fighting in the east. So what's happening is that the Eastern Front is more of a fixing attack to hold the Ukrainian army in place, while the pincers come from north and south to cut it off. As Marlene mentioned, there was basically a major miscalculation here of the Ukrainian will to fight and the potential for resistance. So far, the Russians have been unable to take major Ukrainian cities. There have been some reports of supply and morale problems, disorganization on the Russian side, although they appear to be regrouping. Developments, what we're seeing, increasing reliance on the purposeful targeting of civilians, both in Kiev and in Kharkov, as a way of inflicting costs and terrorizing the population. And also we're seeing redoubled efforts to get to Kiev and seize that city. So you've probably seen the satellite photos of a very large Russian column approaching Kiev from the north and the west. So how things may unfold from here, right? There's basically a race between the Russians' ability to advance and the Ukrainians' ability to regroup and resupply, and also a race between the Russians' ability to win the war quickly and the pain that's being inflicted on Russia economically. The Russians are moving west of Kiev, and you're seeing more activity in the western part of the country, possible Belarusian attack from the north. And this is all about interdicting supplies that are coming from a lot of Western countries into Kiev from the west. The Ukrainian government will probably face a difficult decision very soon about what to do about the army in the east, whether to withdraw behind the Dnieper and cede that territory or risk being encircled. And we're seeing even less restraint. Doesn't look like there's much restraint, but even less restraint of Russian air, artillery, rocket launcher systems, thermobaric fuel air, explosive devices versus civilian areas. So that's kind of the military situation, not very pretty. The Russian goal here, I think, is regime change, right? And it's motivated by the goal of regime changers for hundreds of years, which is get rid of a troublesome or threatening leader by replacing them with a leader who shares your own preferences and ideas. And in this case, the idea is to get rid of the pro-Western Zelensky regime and replace it with some pro-Russian puppet to be determined, who's going to try and turn back the clock to 2014, when you had Viktor Yanukovych seeking to move Ukraine out of the Western camp and towards Russia. As Marlene mentioned, there's seen an escalation over time here. Putin's goal is basically to assert Russia's right or status as a great power, to maintain a sphere of influence and a buffer against NATO. He's tried coercive diplomacy, right? Mobilizing all these forces, placing them around the borders, using threats of force to change Ukraine's aspiration, to change NATO's position on accession by Ukraine. But what happens if you can't persuade an adversary regime to do what you like? Well, the temptation is to get rid of it and put one in that will. And this is especially a major temptation when you're much more powerful than the target. Of course, it's made more difficult in this case because there was really no one to work with in Ukraine, in the centers of power that could help you get regime change done without having to use serious force. So the separatists in the East were not going to be able to topple the regime. And so that kind of short-circuited any ability Putin had to try to change the regime without having to do an invasion. So assuming this happens, assuming the Russians, and I'm not, of course, advocating this in any way or predicting it, assuming the Russians are able to get to Kiev, get to Zelensky, seize the most of the country, establish a new pro-Russian regime. Okay, what happens? Peace and stability, a leader that's able to maintain him or herself in power, good relations between the countries. My research, as Alyssa kindly mentioned, Dean Ayres kindly mentioned, my recent book, shows that foreign imposed regime change in general, and particularly the kind that Russia is attempting here in Ukraine, which is simply putting in a puppet leader rather than trying to build much in the way of institutions, tends to have lots of bad effects. It leads to insurgency and civil war. It often results in the leader that's installed being removed violently, and it can actually worsen relations between the intervener and the target. Let me explain just briefly how this works. There's two things that can happen. One is what I call military disintegration. This is when, as in Iraq and Afghanistan, the target army, instead of sort of surrendering in an orderly fashion, sort of falls apart, escapes to various areas, whether it's across borders, remote parts of the country, and continues the fight in an insurgency. This situation actually reminds me a lot of Cambodia in 1979. When the Vietnamese invaded, the bulk of the Cambodian army was in the east. The Vietnamese blew through it and encircled it, and what remained ran for their lives to the eastern part of the country and the Thai border and continued the resistance. So leaders in this case have both motive to try and get back in power, and they have the opportunity or the forces at their disposal to try and do that. So insurgency is often the result. Then you can have, the second thing that can happen is what I call a sort of interest divergence, right? So interveners go in to overthrow foreign rulers. They're not doing this out of altruism. They want to pursue their own interests, right? In this case, get a pro-Russian leader in power. So they're going to do that. They're installing an agent to essentially run the country for them. But there's another group that gets a say in all this, and that's the domestic population in the target country. And the interests, and this is very clear in this case, the interests of the leader that's put in power often diverge quite severely from what the domestic population wants. So if the leader leans heavily towards the intervener, which often needs to prop him or her up, that's likely to trigger resistance from the domestic population. And the opposite, which is not the case in this instance, is also true, which is if you sort of think the domestic population is your main threat, you might tilt towards appeasing them, anger your patron who may try to remove you. So you're kind of damned if you do and damned if you don't. The consequences of all this, depending on which way the leader leans, is civil war, likely afterwards, violent leader removal. The imposed leaders don't tend to survive very long before they are removed by force, and potentially bad interstate relations. We don't see the needle move a lot in terms of how well the two countries get along. And you can even get violent conflict between the two afterwards, again, depending on which way the leader leans. So what does this all mean for this situation? It's kind of a be careful what you wish for situation. It really couldn't be clearer that the vast majority of Ukrainians vehemently oppose any pro-Russian leader. This is a large country. It has a large population. It's not a small micro-state. As the ambassador mentioned, it's now largely pro-Western as a function of past events. It's now in favor of NATO membership, certainly EU membership. How do you control a country like this afterwards is a big question, right? The United States had very difficult time controlling smaller countries with 100 or 150,000 troops. The Soviets, Russian predecessors, very difficult time in Afghanistan trying to control that country with 100,000 troops, especially when you have a nearby country or as to act as a sanctuary or as a base of supply for the insurgents. And the potential also for the Ukrainian military, or much of it, to escape and to act as basically the base of a new insurgency. But it's been, I think, quite eye-opening to see what has happened in terms of resistance the stories that I've seen about women, creating Molotov cocktails and people, civilians off the street going in, and I want a gun. I want to defend my country. So likely to be a lot of trouble. And so what are Russia's options? Well, one thing they might do is stop now, sort of having shown their resolve, and try to cut some kind of deal that achieves their objectives. Now, the question is it too late for that, right? As the attack itself galvanized the West and Ukrainians so much that is off the table. But so if they succeed and they face armed resistance with external sanctuary and support, well, one thing that occupiers or interveners have sometimes used with some level of effectiveness is massive, widespread repression. Not what Russia does at home, which is bad enough, but much worse. Think Soviets in Eastern Europe, where there were large-scale deportations. There were massive and effective repressive institutions installed. Think Iran and Savak, or Chile and Dina. These are really painful measures that can be inflicted on the population in an attempt to control it. Now, so in other words, things can get uglier after the war than they were during the war, and it's pretty ugly during the war. Now, I'm not saying that will be successful. I'm not really confident the Russians are able to do that, but we do know they can be extremely brutal. All we have to do is look at the conduct of their recent wars to see that, and what they're doing to Ukrainian cities now and what they're liable to do. So I wish I had a more upbeat message, but there's likely to be violence, and it may be worse afterwards than it already is.
Thank you, Alex. Charlie, do you want to pick up from there? What strikes you as some additional security questions we need to focus on here? You're on mute.
Sorry, so I'm going to try to keep my comments brief. Those were really excellent broad comments by all the commentators, and I'm going to try to not overlap with them too much. So I'm going to try to make 3 points. First is, I think it's useful to think back to U.S. diplomacy in the period that led up to the war. And it will be some criticism of the U.S., but it's more forward-looking than backward-looking. But I want to be clear at the beginning. I mean, I think overall U.S. policy has been good. I think it's correct that we have decided not to put U.S. or NATO troops on the ground. And the blame is clearly Putin's for the war. So I don't want to get that confused. But I do want to say that the United States said that we were willing to engage in diplomacy, and that we gave Russia the opportunity of diplomacy instead of war. But when we did that, we actually didn't put the things on the table that were of interest to Putin. And there's one very important possibility that I think would not have been costly, which might have mattered. It might not have mattered, but it might. And that would have been to make clear that Ukraine was not going to become a member of NATO anytime soon. And this was the fact. It wasn't going to be. It wouldn't have been costly in terms of actual action, but it could be costly in terms of some number of principles. And this is actually what the United States argued. The United States argued on principle that we should not, that this could not be a concession that we made, particularly under the kind of coercive pressure that Putin was imposing. And the principle are the type that states should have the opportunity to choose their own foreign policies, that major powers should not be able to influence those foreign policies unduly, and that states don't have, major powers don't get to have spheres of influence in the 21st century. All of which sounds good, but it's important to recognize that the United States doesn't actually follow this principle. We have bent it when it was in our interest, including very broadly the Monroe Doctrine, but we still don't, throughout the Cold War, we didn't tolerate Soviet influence in the Western Hemisphere. If you think about the Cuban Missile Crisis, which may be well known, was about not allowing the Soviet Union to have nuclear weapons in Cuba and to deepen that military alliance. So none of this is to argue that Russia in any way has a right to have influence over Ukraine, but it is to say that in the context of international politics, that power and interest matter a great deal, and principles sometimes can wisely be need to be compromised. So why does this matter now? I think the thing I would say, if we get to a point where both Ukraine and Russia are interested in serious negotiation, which could happen if Russia does not succeed militarily in the next few weeks, one of the possibilities that could be negotiated would be an agreement that Ukraine will not join NATO for the foreseeable future. It doesn't have to say not forever, but for the foreseeable future. And I think we need to be careful that not take this off the table or not encourage Ukraine to take this off the table. It's not a big concession. It's a violation of principle, but not a big action concession. And it will give Putin a face-saving way to get out of this conflict, which could actually be very important. And so I just raised that as a first point. The second point I want to make is about escalation. We've heard about Putin putting his nuclear forces on alert. Nobody can figure out why he would do this, and it's not clear that he actually has done it, although he's given the orders. But as at least when I heard most recently, there was no observable actions. But it is important to think about how this could become a larger conflict or a larger war. So the first thing to think about is, in some ways, we're fighting what in international relations terms we would call limited war, where both the West and Russia are at this point accepting limits on what they could do to each other. In other words, they're both fighting very hard. Ukraine is fighting very hard, Russia is fighting very hard, but Russia could inflict costs on Western Europe and the United States that it is not, both by cyber attacks, but conceivably by nuclear. The United States can do the same, of course, to Russia, and it could also impose more costly sanctions than it has. And so in this kind of situation, in a sense, you're in a kind of bargaining situation, which is in the background of the actual fighting on the ground. And the question is, how do we proceed, given that we're actually, that Ukraine is fighting, we're supporting Ukraine, but there's also this background of the potential of escalation. There's much to be said about this and no good, simple answer. But the thing I would say about here is that I think we actually need to be somewhat cautious in the cost that we impose on Putin. And this actually goes against my initial instincts. My instinct was, boy, why don't we even impose more costly sanctions? Why don't we cut off the oil? You know, it will be very difficult, but the West has huge oil reserves. We could outlast this actually on the oil side, not on the gas side. At least we could do it. The problem with that is at some point, if the costs are too large and too immediate, Putin may actually, for reasons that Marlene and also especially though the ambassador have mentioned, Putin could actually start to fear for his own regime. He could feel that the costs are too large, that he's backed into a corner and he himself is actually vulnerable. And that's when he's most likely to act erratically, or even not erratically, maybe rationally, but take really large risks. And so I think we need to it's a very tricky balance and it's hard to know how to strike it, but we need to balance out imposing very large punishment on the one hand without totally undermining him on the other hand, and leading him to sort of broaden the war into a conflict which is much more costly for many parties involved. This could happen along many routes, and I don't want to take much more time, but it could happen through large cyber attacks against the United States, which he could justify as being appropriate given the costs the United States is inflicting on Russia. It could happen sort of accidentally by a cyber attack in Ukraine or Western Europe that hits the United States hard, so on and so forth. But I think if you think about this kind of escalation step by step, you can start to tell a story about how you get nuclear weapons used, but fortunately, I think it's quite hard. My third point goes to East Asia and the question which I think many people have mentioned about the implications of Ukraine for Taiwan and China-Taiwan conflict. The parallels are in many ways striking to the point of being unnerving, I think. Both Ukraine and Taiwan face much more powerful states that believe they are part of that country. Much more deeply embedded in the Chinese consciousness, as I understand it, and culture than Ukraine is in the Russian, but not different from Putin's recent narrative. Both countries have some question about whether the West would defend them, although in the Ukraine case, it was pretty clear we wouldn't. In the Taiwan case, there's uncertainty about whether we will, although I think many people believe that we will. So there's once again a lot to be said about this, but I think there's countervailing influences we could see on China. Right. So on the one hand, China may be impressed or even misled by the fact that the United States didn't come to the aid of Ukraine, and it could take the lesson to be that the United States will not come to the aid of Taiwan. So given that this could lead to another war, and one that the United States might be much more likely to be involved in, I think it's important for the United States to make clear to China that we will intervene to protect Taiwan if in fact that's what we plan to do. The worst of all worlds is for the Chinese to think we won't, and for us to actually plan to come defend Taiwan. It's a whole other big question about whether we should, about the commitment to Taiwan, but this is different right now. And so I think here we need to be clear. We should tell the Chinese, I would tell them privately, lots of China experts are against clarifying this commitment. I don't think we need to do it publicly. We don't need to provoke or try to put push China into a corner, but we should tell them privately that we are going to defend Taiwan if we're going to. On the flip side, China might actually be impressed in the sense of being deterred by the extent of sanctions that the West is imposing on Ukraine. And they may come to see that and realize that even if the United States doesn't fight, and certainly if it does fight, that China really could face extremely harsh economic sanctions. And I think people have been impressed and a little surprised by how united Western Europe has been in the face of potentially quite costly sanctions. And also that you have Australia, New Zealand, and Japan also imposing sanctions, and Switzerland limiting access to bank accounts. So if China had any doubts about the extent of the possible sanctions, I think that the reaction in Ukraine would actually give China greater pause, not see greater opportunity. And in many ways, we have greater leverage over China than we do over Russia, partly because they continue to really depend on US imports of advanced technology, even more than the Russians do. So it's a little hard to read what the net balance is there, but I think the United States needs to attend to this issue. I would not do it the way we're doing it. I would not send a delegation like we are now of former diplomats to Taiwan. I'm not much less worried about reassuring the Taiwanese than I'm about making clear to the Chinese. But I'll end my remarks there. Thank you.
Thank you. And that is the perfect segue to Mike Moore. Mike, talk a little bit about sanctions, which is just playing an enormous role in this crisis.
Well, unlike the rest of these folks, I'm just a poor economist, so I don't know much about Ukraine other than what I have read about for years as an observer. But I do know a little bit about economic sanctions, as they have played a role in international relations. A week ago, I would have said, there's not going to be much that we're going to be able to do to marshal support across nations. They will probably be pretty ineffective because we won't pull the trigger on, so to speak, on some of the major ways to inflict pain on Russia. And I think most observers have been quite impressed with the ability of the Biden administration and especially European countries to join together to have an effective multilateral sanctions on Russia. And before we get any further, you want to talk about sort of how sanctions play a role. On the one hand, you can use sanctions to punish behavior. And the second one is use sanctions to alter behavior. It can be difficult to pull off the first if you have leaky sanctions and the ways to get around it. And that's, I think a lot of times sanctions are kind of a feel-good effort to try to do something short of military action. This is not of that type, and I'll talk about some of those particular sanctions in just a moment, but this is really raising serious economic costs on Russia. I have serious doubts on whether or not it changes the basic calculus of Putin to make different decisions. And I have to defer to my Russian experts to know a little bit more to opine on that. But let's talk a little before mention, these things, we should remember that there have been sanctions on a number of autocratic countries for decades, on Cuba, on North Korea, on Iran, Iraq. All of these leaders have been willing to put their populace into grave economic crises in pursuit of their own, often megalomaniac goals. So it's really hard to push that behavior by economic sanctions. Now, what we've seen so far maybe I should mention just a little about what has actually happened. Basically, the US and its allies have limited the ability of Russian financial institutions to access the international system, both commercial banks, but importantly, the Russian central bank, which has made it difficult to defend the ruble. That's, I think, a real surprise to Putin. In fact, I think generally the reaction of the West and other countries around the world are probably a surprise to Putin to the extent to which they've been able to coordinate. But this has resulted in a pretty significant drop of the ruble. Russian stock exchange closed. These are serious things that right now have affected mainly Russian businesses, not so much individual Russian consumers yet. But that will likely come down the line if these actions continue. Clearly, the most important change in behavior in recent days is Germany's willingness to join in these efforts. Germany has been very hesitant to use sanctions as a deterrent. It's different to use sanctions as punishment. And they clearly have crossed a threshold in Germany with a new social democratic premier who has increased the defense budget and at least in the short term, sent offensive weapons to Ukraine and really involved Germany in the financial sanctions. And I'd be stunned if Putin was not stunned with that ability to coordinate those efforts. So real sanctions. But it's important to note what has not been included, which is the oil and gas sector. As far as I know, Russia's not threatened to cut that off. The West is not threatening to make it impossible to sell. This is this linchpin that is really where the integration of Europe into the Russian economy really takes place. And so far, both sides have been not willing to go there. Wars bring unexpected activity. Things spiral out of control. There are ways in which oil and gas could be blocked in an unexpected way, which brings up kind of the next part of this. Are the sanctions sustainable over a long period of time? This is not something I would be stunned if this changed the behavior over the next week or months. Sanctions in place for years, especially as Alex said, Russia comes in, they have a puppet regime, they're dealing with an insurgency. How long do the sanctions keep in place? And I have my doubts about the ability of Europe to quickly pivot to a non-Russian energy reliance. Maybe they can. I would personally love to see Germany, I don't know whether this is technically possible, to restart the nuclear reactors and use that as an alternative source of electricity and wean themselves away from Russian oil and gas exports on a more permanent basis, because that's really where the pressure needs to be, not on the short term, but on the long term. Russia is heavily dependent on exports of primary commodities, oil, gas, wheat. Those are areas that there are potentially alternative sources, and the West should move away from those. So Russia is the source. Germany and others were very optimistic that maybe Russia could stay within this international system. I don't see how one could look over the next few years and say, Russia's a great place to invest. Putin's going to change his ways and everything's going to be back to normal. This is a regime change in a certain sense of the decisions of being involved with Russia seem to be, I think, fundamentally changed. Does that change Putin's behavior? I don't know. Which brings up really my last point, and sort of following on to Charlie's. Medium term, even long term, what's the relationship between China and Russia? You don't change a pipeline going from through over the Baltic to suddenly be a terminus in Beijing over 6 months, but it could happen over many, many years. And so that, I don't know how that would work out, but that's a potential source of evading the sanctions, which is quite worrying over the long term. But bottom line is, I don't think economic sanctions are going to be the way in which Putin's decisions are changed. It will put enormous pressure on the Russian people, and would note that the Russians have been through some really tough times historically, even in the last 15 years, with economic dislocation, and Putin has remained in power. So I have my doubts about that. The tragedy is, if Putin's behavior is going to change, it's probably going to be after the spilling of blood by innocent Ukrainians and Russian troops. It's not going to be changed by economic sanctions. So let me end there.
Thank you, Mike. We've had a lot of questions coming in and about 15 minutes to get to them. Let me try one that this could be either for Marlene or perhaps for Kurt. With regards to Germany's historic turnaround in terms of sending weapons to Ukraine and its vow to finally pay its 2% GDP for defense in direct response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, will this decision encourage other countries to start paying their fair share? I believe the implication is other NATO countries.
Yeah, I think Kurt would continue on that. Yeah, I think that there is a big kind of waking up call in Europe in terms of kind of putting an end to this myth or this dream or this hope of Europe being outside of a war context and peace being something obvious to European culture. I think what Russia is doing to Europe is to kind of sending the signals that war is not something from the past, and kind of old-fashioned territorial wars are not something from the past, and therefore I think that will be now a totally different level of European discussion on their military investment.
Yeah, I would agree, and I just add one more comment to that, is not only in defense spending, but in approach to dealing with Russia. I think Europe is going to fundamentally change now. We've had many countries in Europe over the past 15, 20 years build up substantial business relationships and ties and financial ties to Russia, a lot of sympathy for Russia. And I think that is now destroyed. And I don't think it's going to be rebuilt quickly at all.
Okay, we've got a question here that I think is right in Alex's wheelhouse. How can the UN or countries supporting Ukraine bring war crime charges and sanctions against Putin and his officials and military for their actions against civilians in Ukraine?
Well, I think that will be done. I read that the ICC is already moving to open an investigation on what's already happened, which in my view, limited information, but from what I've seen, do look like war crimes, intentional targeting of civilian neighborhoods and buildings and areas. That's right outside of the laws of war, which say that you must distinguish between combatant and non-combatant targets, and then you must exercise proportionality in terms of the damage that you inflict on civilians in pursuit of military objectives. The influence that will have on the Russians, I believe, is basically nil. To have influence, the perpetrators need to be vulnerable. It will, of course, really limit their ability to travel, were it to ever be possible again, for folks who gave these orders to go outside the country because of universal jurisdiction, right? You don't have to, fall into the hands of the ICC. You can go to any country and they can prosecute you for war crimes. These kind of crimes have universal jurisdiction. Some have argued that these kinds of things can exert influence at the lower levels of commanders or soldiers who are the ones tasked with executing these kinds of attacks. Again, I'm skeptical in this situation, not to say that it's not applicable in other countries or other countries' militaries or other conflicts. But here I'd be surprised to see disobedience of commands unless you get to the nuclear level, as Charlie mentioned, right? Would Russian commanders sign off on that? Which I doubt.
We've got a question from one of our alums, I believe. I hope I am not mispronouncing your name, Velko Milonjic. Since the question is, since I'm coming from the Western Balkans, Montenegro, I have certain fears on how this war in Ukraine and Russian aggression might reflect in other regions, namely the Western Balkans. In Montenegro, just before our NATO membership in 2016, we experienced the attempt of Russian physical intervention through covert action of their proxies. After our NATO membership, we experienced Russian hybrid capabilities, which led to our current political situation, not only in Montenegro, but across the region. Today, Serbia and one of the entities within the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina failed to condemn Russian aggression, trying to explain or justify their policies with their experience from the recent history. My question is, if Russia, with their proxies, might open other crises or fronts, diversifying conflicts so that there is greater space for their manipulation. Who would like to take that?
I'm happy to comment.
Yeah, please.
Maybe not the only one. So greetings, Velko. We still have to get together. On the current situation, Russia is throwing everything it has at Ukraine. It's not going well. They have regrouped. They've brought supplies forward. They're surrounding Kyiv. I just read that they took out all the television stations now in Kyiv. They will be going for power, I'm sure, pretty soon. So it's brutal and immediate, and it's massive, and that is where Putin's effort is. If he succeeds in subduing Ukraine, and as Alexander says, it's not going to be that easy, but if he succeeds in subduing Ukraine, then I think absolutely yes, he will be moving on to other things. I think he has other countries in his hit list to rebuild the former Soviet territories under a Russian empire, such as Georgia and Moldova. And I also think he has already, and he will continue to instrumentalize Serbian nationalism as a way to extend Russian influence in the Balkans, keep countries away from Europe and NATO, and exercise influence through creation of a client relationship with Serbia. This has already been the case. And they use various means, as you said, energy, the Orthodox Church, payments, money, weaponry, everything that they can think of to build that relationship with Serbia and extend Russia's influence in the Balkans. It's on kind of a low burn right now because of the attention on Ukraine. If he manages to stabilize his control of Ukraine, he'll come back to it.
If I can just add, I think one of the other fronts where war could be reopened is the Karabakh. I think the weakening or the fact that Russia is so busy with Ukraine also means that Armenia is even more by itself than it was before. And that could be also sending the signal for Azerbaijan that if they want to get more, it's the right time to do that because Russia is busy somewhere else.
We've got a question from Alex Lennon of the Washington Quarterly. This is for Kurt and for Charlie. Are spheres of influence back? If so, to what extent does it matter to U.S. interests? If it does, has the U.S. population become more polarized and neo-isolationist to the point where it is less likely to do something about it? Charlie, do you want to go first? Yeah.
Go first, yeah. Alex, I think that spheres of influence may be I wouldn't say they're back because I don't think they went away. And the United States continues to have its sphere or spheres of influence, and it's trying in many ways to deny China a sphere of influence in East Asia, and it is doing something about it. And so I think that what you're seeing is you're seeing more new powers, or not new powers, but restored or rising powers that want a sphere of influence, and the United States is has its, and it's denying them theirs, or trying to. Well, I will say that NATO is a huge sphere of influence, if you think about it that way, in Western and Central Europe, for the United States. So I think that we see both the willingness to exert or use our energy to preserve and deny spheres of influence. And it's not so much that they're back, but that you have powers now that in their own regions would like to have their own spheres or larger spheres that they don't yet have.
I have a slightly different take on that, just thinking about it, particularly in the European context. So the Helsinki Accords of 1975 were explicit in establishing that every country has a right to its sovereignty and territorial integrity. There should be a refraining from the threat or use of force, no change of borders by force, no interference in the internal affairs of other countries, and the right of countries to choose their own security alliances. And this was an explicit rejection of the dividing up of Europe under Yalta that took place right at the end of World War II. The Helsinki Accords were designed with these 10 principles to establish something else, and that became the foundations of a European security architecture that the Soviet Union agreed to, that later Russia agreed to when Russia became an independent state. It was formulated in multiple documents and referred to in multiple documents, including the NATO-Russia Founding Act and the Charter of Paris for a New Europe in 1990, and the OSCE's Istanbul document in 1999. So Putin, since 2007, announced his intention to reverse this. And what he is doing now, particularly the demands that he made in writing to the United States and NATO on December 17th last year, were explicit in rejecting the principles of the Helsinki Accords and that have underpinned European security ever since, and seeking to go back exactly to this sphere of influence situation, which all other countries in Europe reject. And so this was the response to Russia, is that no, we don't agree that some countries will be subordinated to Russian rule. And just to comment on NATO as well, I wouldn't call NATO a sphere of influence, because NATO is an alliance of individual sovereign states that come together. And we disagree over a lot of things. We don't do a lot of things that the United States might like to do, or that Turkey might like to do, or that even in some cases France would like to do with some of the operations in Africa that the US doesn't want to do. So it doesn't operate really as a sphere of influence. It does operate as an alliance of sovereign countries for mutual self-protection, for collective defense, and there it does work. And I think that is fundamentally different than what we're talking about with the sphere of influence, where state sovereignty is limited.
Thank you. One quick last question, back on the question of sanctions. Will the domestic instability caused by economic sanctions cause enough internal strife in Russia for people to outwardly reject Putin's hold on power? Asking for a conjecture. Does anybody want to take that one?
I would say that not so far. I mean, just in terms of the likely economic impact, I can't speak to how Russians would react to it. Right now, you're talking about much higher inflation, loss of access to consumer goods, some manufacturing goods. I think that's still at the level of manageability by the Putin regime by itself. Other countries have experienced much more severe disruptions, and the regime has stayed in power. But I'm not an expert on Russia, so I'll defer to others.
The last
Yeah,
comment?
I think if I can add, I think the resilience of the Russian population is still pretty strong, and they can still make that for pretty long. The resilience of the elites in another thing. I think there are a lot of rich people in Russia that are pretty unhappy with the situation. So you could also imagine that kind of changes or instabilities would come more at the elite level than necessarily at the population level.
Time for one more comment, Dean Ayres?
Sure. Yep.
I mean, a lot of this depends on the structure of the regime. When you see countries under pressure like this, Putin is already arresting large numbers. There may be even more of an escalation of force against the population. A lot hinges on what the military will do and how dependent it is on its own survival from Putin. And also, as Marlene mentioned, the other elites that could potentially turn on Putin and hold him accountable. And we don't know a lot about that yet.
So let me thank.
I wish we could
yeah.
ask about the role of Russia in the Iran nuclear talks, because I don't know, but that's another thing. I wish I knew about that, because they're supposed to be playing a role. But
that's a topic for a good next panel discussion, I think. Let me thank all of you for making the time for this. I mean, what a terrific conversation here. Thank you so much. We're going to be putting this recording up online as soon as we possibly can later today. There's been a lot of interest in this discussion. Unfortunately, I think this conflict will be with us for some time to come. So look forward to convening other Elliott School faculty experts and alums who can bring additional insights to this question. We've got a great set of additional questions that we'll make sure to download and pass to each of you in case you're interested in what else people wanted to hear about in the course of this conversation. Thank you all, and have a great rest of your day.